Hey guys, hope you're all doing well. Welcome to History 1700. Um, so today we're going to be discussing what is often called in American history the beginnings of the American Republic or the early Republic. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the time period going from the presidency of George Washington to the presidency of James Monroe. So about 1789 to 1825. The presidencies we'll be discussing is the administrations are Washington, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Now, a couple of announcements or just reminders for you guys. So first, I believe I gave you guys the assignment last time to read chapters 8 and 9 in your textbook, Give Me Liberty. Hopefully, you've been keeping up on your reading. It's going to be really important as far as making sure that you can do your analytical writing assignments correctly, and also you can prepare for reading quizzes and for the midterm as well. For next week, the expectation is to read chapters 10, 11, and 12. 10, 11, and 12. It will help you go over Antebellum America, which will be our lecture for next time. And I appreciate you guys meeting together this way. I know it's not a little bit unorthodox, probably not what you're used to, but I appreciate the flexibility. So hopefully you're able to follow along. Hopefully this works out. I'm recording this with the hopes that there will be no technical difficulties, but you never know. Another thing as well, just so you guys are clear, I did finish grading your first papers, your analytical writing assignments for the Declaration of Independence. Thomas did tell me that some of you were asking about getting feedback on your papers. It's a little bit difficult, unfortunately. I don't really have a means of printing every single one out, making marks on them, sending them back. But I will say this, overall, I was very impressed with the papers. For your first papers, really, really excellent job. Honestly, a lot of you did better than I've seen some freshmen in college, like 18, 19-year-olds do. Now just a couple of critiques. So first and foremost, please just make sure that you write more than one draft. I would encourage you to write at least two, especially when it comes to your spelling and your grammar. Just make sure that you're double checking that everything is spelled correctly. It's also not a bad idea to have you guys peer review each other's papers, right? If you're in this class together, if you have the time, if you guys are in proximity to one another, and you're able to, right, take the time to peer review each other's papers, right, get some insight from other people, really is not a bad idea. Can kind of help you along with the writing process. So just make sure you're checking your spelling and grammar. Just make sure as well what needs to be capitalized is capitalized. Some of you didn't capitalize Declaration of Independence. So like that needs to be capitalized. Also, just make sure that you're using correct formatting, right? So that you indent the beginning of your paragraphs. If you're typing it out, that it's double spaced. You can even write it double spaced as well if you're handwriting it, doing a hard copy. That's fine as well. Another thing as well, just please make sure that you're following the format that was given, right? You have the instructions given to you. I gave you the example essay. Just make sure you're sticking as close to that as possible. And also, the expectation is that it's at least around 600 words. I'm not going to count exactly how many words there are. I can usually tell how many words there are just by skimming through it. But as long as there's, let's say, about 500, at least 550 words, I'm usually okay with that. But for some, there were a couple of you who submitted papers that you had maybe maybe 400 words. For that, I do have to dock at least 5 points, right? Because that's not meeting with the requirements. And that can affect your grade significantly if that becomes a recurring problem. So those are just my main critiques. Again, just make sure you're following the guidelines. Make sure that you're checking your spelling and grammar, and just be on top of it. Again, by way of reminder, your analytical writing assignment for the preamble to the Constitution is going to be due next week on September 25th. And I will send out a reminder to Thomas, Kabor as well. Kabor, just make sure that you get those papers and get them submitted so Thomas can scan them and send them to me and I can get them graded. And then when I get back, first Wednesday in October, we'll be going back to our regular schedule with papers, with quizzes, and all of that. And I'll continue to give you guys your assignments for your readings, just so you can stay on top of that. Okay, excellent. All right, let's go ahead and dive into it. Okay, so as I said before, the um the lecture today is on what most historians call the early republic, right? This is a time in American history when the Constitution, it's still new, it's still fresh, right? Many Americans are still kind of figuring out what exactly is this nation going to look at, like, right? What is the destiny of the United States going to be? Um, should we be more favorable towards perhaps agrarianism, right, towards agriculture, or should we become more industrialized, right, focus more on banking and finance, right? And what we see happening early in Washington's presidency are these dueling visions playing out against one another, right? The side that favors more banking and industrialist, and perhaps you could even say a more British approach to governance, would be the Hamiltonians or Alexander Hamilton. And then the side that favors the French, right, especially during the French Revolution, the side that favors agrarianism, right, agriculture, more states' rights, right, the Jeffersonians, right, led by Thomas Jefferson, also James Madison as well is a major player in this party. We see these two sides dueling it out. It seems as if Hamilton's party, the Federalists, kind of have the upper hand in the 1790s. But then by the election of 1800, Jefferson's Democratic Republicans are able to take power and able to seemingly hold on to power indefinitely, right? The Federalists they become a dying party and eventually they die out, right? There are no Federalists alive today. They don't exist. But for a time, the Federalists were one of the two major parties that existed in the United States. Okay. So let's begin with George Washington. As I said, we're gonna go through each of these presidencies, and God, I feel like the side of my face is really dark. I'm gonna lighten up just a little bit. That's actually too bright. Okay, we'll just keep it like that. Um, so with George Washington, we talked a little bit about this last time already. So on December 23rd of 1783, he resigns his commission as commander of the Continental Army, right? Incredibly significant decision in American history, kind of um, breaking the wheel of revolutions, if you will. Right, sorry about that. I lit another light in the room so you could see my face a little bit better. Um, so we already talked about this last time, right? In some detail, kind of the events that surrounded this, right? This was considered an incredibly significant moment in American history, and really in world history as well. Right? The kind of the usual cycle of revolutions throughout most of history was that you'd have a powerful military commander take control. They become incredibly popular with the people, and they would have a mandate from the people to take power, to take control, to set things in order. Right? The Continental Congress, they were not popular. They were seen as quite ineffective, as quite feckless, incapable of actual good governance. But Washington, recognizing the importance of giving up power, right, setting an example, which this wouldn't be the first time he did this. He resigned his commission, and King George III, right, when he heard about this story, he stated if he does that, which resigned his authority, he will be the greatest man in the world, right? And that's one of the reasons why Washington is considered, right, the man of the revolution, right, the father of his country, one of America's greatest statesmen, right? Like there is a reason why Washington is America, like the American man in every sense of the word. So, with Washington, a couple of things about him. So he resigns his commission December 23rd, 1783. He decides that he's going to retire to Mount Vernon, right? He's done with public duty. He's done serving in the military. He has no interest whatsoever in continuing to get involved in political or military affairs. But by 1787, again, as we talked about last time, many people in the country, many leaders recognize the need for a new system of governance, right? The Articles of Confederation are not working whatsoever. And so Madison is able to convince Washington to come preside or be the president of the 1787 Philadelphia Convention, right? If Washington had not been there, the convention would have failed, right? There were many delegates who were unwilling, absolutely unwilling to come to the convention unless Washington was there, right? His very presence lent this convention a great sense of credibility. And so with that, he comes, and again, there's a very, very good argument that's put forward by some historians to say Madison really shouldn't be given the title of the uh, the father of the Constitution, right? The true father of the Constitution is the father of the country, right? George Washington. Again, the Constitution would not have been possible without George Washington. Now, when the Constitution is ratified, right, one of the things that the Constitution calls for in Article 2 is there for it to be a chief executive, right? That was one of the things the Articles of Confederation did not have. The Constitution did call for there to be a president, for them to serve for a term for 4 years, and the only serious candidate was Washington, right? Again, there was a lot of heated contention about who is going to be the first president, who we're going to give this amount of power to, because if you read the Constitution, if you read Article 2, it's pretty vague about what the president's actual powers are, right? It's very, very clear about it gives the presidents a few powers, but then it's not very clear about like the do's and don'ts. And Washington was stepping into this role with the expectation that he would set a precedent, right? He's the man who had given up power before in 1783, and he could be expected to exercise restraint when it came to wielding executive power, I should say. So he wins. He wins in 1788. The very first election in American history, right? Very first presidential election, 1788. Washington wins. It's unanimous. There's no other contenders, and John Adams is elected as his vice president. Now, in those days before the 12th Amendment, the way that it worked is that whoever you had electors who would cast two different votes, right? They would first cast a vote for two different people, I should say. Whoever got the most votes, became the president, and whoever got the second most votes became vice president. Now, as we'll talk about later, this later becomes a huge problem. Because what happens when the person who gets the first votes the person who gets the second votes are from different parties, right? That can cause a lot of friction. Could you imagine? Could you imagine the rules hadn't been changed, and today, Joe Biden was the president of the United States and Donald Trump was his vice president? Or going back to 2016, right? Donald Trump is president and Hillary Clinton is his vice president, right? It'd be an absolute catastrophe. Uh, but we don't have it set up that way anymore. So the first administration brings in several key leaders. Who often opposed each other, right? Washington wanted the best minds, and he did, right? This was an incredibly talented cabinet, but the problem is they had such radically different ideas about the nature of governance and kind of what role the federal government should play in the new nation, right? So John Adams, he's separately elected. He's vice president. John Adams was later to say he hated this position. He would say that there is no office more useless than that of the vice presidency. And there would be other people in the history of the vice presidency who would say as much, who would basically say as much, right? I think there was one vice president whose name I forget. He said the vice presidency was worth as much as a warm bucket of spit, right? Because again, the Constitution doesn't really say what the role of the vice president is supposed to be, except preside over the Senate, be president of the Senate. And again, what exactly that means, we just don't really know. Right? There's been some formal powers given, but they're very far and few in between. Alexander Hamilton, right? He's Secretary of the Treasury. Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State. And Washington had this idea of general belief in the politics of unity, right? That there should be no parties, there should be no factions, right? In his farewell address to president, he talks extensively about this, right? That there should be no there should be no factions or political parties in the United States. Obviously, we didn't listen to his advice, right? Political parties are very much of our political system today. Okay, Alexander Hamilton. So just kind of talking about the kind of the chief rivals in his cabinet. So Alexander Hamilton, his Secretary of Treasury, he was someone who very much admired the British system of banking and finance. Now, one thing you need to know about Hamilton, how he became known to Washington, he was actually one of Washington's aide-de-camps during the war. And Hamilton was kind of like Washington. they had both seen the failures of a weak government, of a weak decentralized government, right? They had both been present when soldiers were starving. They didn't have supplies, when they weren't receiving pay. Hamilton found it incredibly frustrating that they almost lost the war because of bad government. Right. So Hamilton believed a more strong central government was necessary to strengthen the cause of the United States and make it legitimate in the eyes of the world. Right. And doing that was having a sound financial system, a good credit system in place. And so he puts forth his financial program. Automatically means opposition, right? The purpose of this, it was meant to establish a national bank, right? Kind of like what the British have. Today, the National Bank kind of is the Federal Reserve. It's not exactly the same as what Hamilton envisioned, but if we're going to say we have a national bank, it would be the Federal Reserve today. Right. Another thing he wanted to do as well is he wanted to pay down national and state debts at full value. Right. Part of doing that was that the national government would assume the debts of the state governments, right, from the war. And that would give the federal government supremacy over the states when it came to financial matters, right? So you want to create new national debt, right? If you have debt, that's how you get credit, right? If you can't have credit, you can't build up a credit score if you don't take out some credit, get some debt, pay it off, right? Show investors, show people you're trustworthy, right? That's what he believed would help this new nation grow. So he wanted to create new national debt, borrowing from both domestic and foreign investors. He also wanted a whiskey tax as well. There was a little bit of a rebellion that happened, called the Whiskey Rebellion in Western Pennsylvania. The national government under Washington had sent out 10,000 troops to go suppress this. Washington actually led these troops into battle, but nothing really ever came of it. The rebellion, once they heard the troops were coming, the rebellion was kind of fizzled out. But these people again were very much opposed to paying a tax on whiskey, right? Hamilton also wanted tariff and subsidies from factories, right? He was someone who very, very much believed that industrialization and urbanization was the future. Now, Jefferson, right? Jefferson was automatically opposed to Hamilton's financial program. So at first, Hamilton and the people who followed him, often called the Federalists, Jefferson and his followers called themselves Republicans, right? Don't confuse them with today's Republicans. It's a completely different political party, right? Completely different political party. So Republicans later they call themselves Democratic Republicans. You had Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. James Madison was serving in the House at the time. They both led the opposition to Hamilton. So the plan favored those who own credit and therefore stood to profit from national assumption of debts, right? So the southern states, like where Madison and Jefferson were from, they had very little debt. They had very, very little debt, so they opposed assumption of states' debts, right? They felt that this assumption of states' debt was going to favor northern states, right? It was going to favor the national government. It was not going to the people who owned the credit were like bankers in New York and Philadelphia, also in Boston as well, are also creditors in England. Right, so there weren't going to be very many people in the South benefiting from this. The other thing as well is as Jefferson and Madison both said, the Constitution does not grant the federal government the right to create a bank, right? And already you have this debate, as we talked about last time, you have this debate over constitutionality when it comes to policies and programs and laws, right? Is it constitutional to build a national bank? And as we'll talk about, Hamilton uses Article 1, Section 8, the necessary and proper clause, saying that we need to pass laws and programs that are necessary and proper to fulfill our other duties, right? In order to excise taxes, right? To regulate the financial affairs of the United States, right? It is necessary and proper for us to establish a bank in order to fulfill our other duties, right? And that is kind of an argument that many people put forward even to this day. So continue moving forward. Now, not only was there division over Hamilton's financial program, he also had division over foreign affairs, most prominently the French Revolution. Now, before we continue, I want to show you guys a quick video. that explains in a little better detail exactly what the French Revolution was and why it happened. Because there's a lot of it's a pretty complicated affair. And I don't want to take the time to explain all of it. So I'm just going to show you guys this video and let me pull this up for you guys. 1 second.
What rights do people have, and where do they come from? Who gets to make decisions for others, and on what authority? And how can we organize society to meet people's needs? These questions challenged an entire nation during the upheaval of the French Revolution. By the end of the 18th century, Europe had undergone a profound intellectual and cultural shift known as the Enlightenment. Philosophers and artists promoted reason and human freedom over tradition and religion. The rise of a middle class and printed materials encouraged political awareness, and the American Revolution had turned a former English colony into an independent republic. Yet France, one of the largest and richest countries in Europe, was still governed by an ancient regime of three rigid social classes called estates. The monarch, King Louis XVI, based his authority on divine right and granted special privileges to the first and second estates, the Catholic clergy and the nobles. The third estate, middle-class merchants and craftsmen, as well as over 20 million peasants, had far less power. And they were the only ones who paid taxes, not just to the king, but to the other estates as well. In bad harvest years, taxation could leave peasants with almost nothing, while the king and nobles lived lavishly on their extracted wealth. But as France sank into debt due to its support of the American Revolution and its long-running war with England, change was needed. King Louis appointed Finance Minister Jacques Necker, who pushed for tax reforms and won public support by openly publishing the government's finances. But the king's advisors strongly opposed these initiatives. Desperate for a solution, the king called a meeting of the Estates General, an assembly of representatives from the three estates, for the first time in 175 years. Although the Third Estate represented 98% of the French population, its vote was equal to each of the other estates. And unsurprisingly, both of the upper classes favored keeping their privileges. Realizing they couldn't get fair representation, the Third Estate broke off, declared themselves the National Assembly, and pledged to draft a new constitution, with or without the other estates. King Louis ordered the First and Second Estates to meet with the National Assembly, but he also dismissed Necker, his popular finance minister. In response, thousands of outraged Parisians joined with sympathetic soldiers to storm the Bastille prison, a symbol of royal power and a large storehouse of weapons. The revolution had begun. As rebellion spread throughout the country, the feudal system was abolished. The Assembly's Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen proclaimed a radical idea for the time: that individual rights and freedoms were fundamental to human nature, and government existed only to protect them. Their privileges gone, many nobles fled abroad, begging foreign rulers to invade France and restore order. And while Louis remained as the figurehead of the constitutional monarchy, he feared for his future. In 1791, he tried to flee the country, but was caught. The attempted escape shattered people's faith in the king. The royal family was arrested, and the king charged with treason. After a trial, the once revered king was publicly beheaded, signaling the end of 1,000 years of monarchy and finalizing the September 21st declaration of the First French Republic, governed by the motto Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité. 9 months later, Queen Marie Antoinette, a foreigner long mocked as Madame Deficit for her extravagant reputation, was executed as well. But the revolution would not end there. Some leaders, not content with just changing the government, sought to completely transform French society. Its religion, its street names, even its calendar. As multiple factions formed, the extremist Jacobins, led by Maximilien Robespierre, launched a reign of terror to suppress the slightest dissent, executing over 20,000 people before the Jacobins' own downfall. Meanwhile, France found itself at war with neighboring monarchs seeking to strangle the revolution before it spread. Amidst the chaos, a general named Napoleon Bonaparte took charge, becoming emperor as he claimed to defend the revolution's democratic values. All in all, the revolution saw 3 constitutions and 5 governments within 10 years, followed by decades alternating between monarchy and revolt before the next republic formed in 1871. And while we celebrate the French Revolution's ideals, we still struggle with many of the same basic questions raised over 2 centuries ago.
Okay, yep. So that pretty much summarizes what the French Revolution was all about. What was what was the point of all of it? And again, it's that video does a pretty good job explaining it, but I mean, it is a pretty complicated affair overall, right? And it was incredibly messy, and some people say in some ways it was kind of a failed revolution, right? That the French ended up going back to monarchy anyway when Napoleon Bonaparte declared himself emperor, right? So and again, we see the French kind of going back and forth between republic and a monarchy until until the republic was established and moved forward beginning in 1871. Okay. So what were the Americans' reaction to all of this, right? What were their perceptions of the French Revolution? Because keep in mind, the French were allies in the American Revolution, right? Without French aid, without French weapons and soldiers in their navy, it's likely we would not have won our independence, right? Even though they are an absolute monarchy, they were willing to assist us in overthrowing the British, who were their hated rivals. Now, there were some people in the American nation, the American states, who viewed the French Revolution as a continuation of Enlightenment principles, Enlightenment ideals, right? The revolution that had begun in the United States in the colonies was now spreading to these European monarchies, right? Like this concept, the divine right of monarchs, was beginning to be overthrown, and they believed this to be wonderful, right? Thomas Jefferson was a huge supporter of this. Jefferson was a Francophile, right? Someone who was very, very warm towards the French. He had served as ambassador to France during the 1780s, and he believed that this was a victory for self-government, right? This was what the revolution was all about, that the Americans should support their fellow freedom lovers, if you will, their fellow liberty lovers in the cause of liberty. But people like Washington and Hamilton, who were a little bit more favored toward the British, at least when it came to their semblance of order and rigidness and stable government, right? They saw anarchy here. And they also feared as well the number of factions, right? This revolution didn't necessarily seem to be rooted in one set of ideals, and it seemed to be rooted in so much violence and just overthrowing institutions that there didn't seem to be a plan in place to create an actual stable government. And that was one of the fears that Washington and others had about this revolution, right? So Washington and Hamilton had believed that it was a victory for anarchy, right? You have this depiction here, right? This very triumphal moment, liberty leading the people, right? This woman herself, she is the embodiment of liberté, leading the people against the tyranny of monarchy, right? This is kind of what Jefferson's vision of all this was. And this political cartoon is called The Radical's Arms, right? You have this awful caricature of the French, right? These pins were what the Jacobins would wear. Again, the faction who were part of the Reign of Terror that led to the death of 20,000 people being guillotined. Interesting enough, the last time a person was guillotined in France was the same year the first Star Wars movie came out, 1977. So it was a pretty common form of execution up until not too very long ago, just a little over 40 years. Now, as I said before, right, Jefferson, he declares it a victory for self-government. Washington and Hamilton declared a victory for anarchy. Right, and what eventually happens, though, is that the revolution ends the Franco-American alliance, right? You have this guy, he calls himself Citizen Genet. He is sent over from the revolutionary government. This is 1790. oh gosh, 1793, 1794. And he wants the United States to honor the treaty that was made with France, right? Because at this time, by 1794, France is under attack from neighboring monarchies. And France goes to the United States and says, well, you Americans made a deal with us, right? you, you Americans made a deal with us, and we came to your aid when we needed it, when you needed it, and now it is your turn to come to our aid. And the argument, and Jefferson is saying, yeah, let's go for it. Let's go to their aid. We're gonna send soldiers. We're gonna send ships. We're gonna light the fires of revolution all across Europe. And Washington and Hamilton are both saying, okay, first of all, we don't have the means and power to do that, right? We're still a small nation. Um, and second of all, we made a treaty. Their argument was we made that treaty with the King of France, right? Which is a government that no longer exists. Right. So you no longer represent the same government that we made that treaty with. So therefore, this Franco-American alliance is over. Right. We are not going to continue to support this treaty. And obviously, this really, really angered the French. And there was a time in the 1790s. There was there were many people who were quite favorable toward the French, right? There were many people who were part of kind of Jefferson's coalition, the Democratic Republicans, who were very very favorable toward the French, and believed that the Americans should go to war for the French on behalf of the French, going to fight against the monarchies that were seeking to oppress the revolution, seeking to suppress it and contain it. All right. And what really got people incensed was the treaty, Jay's Treaty. Now, John Jay, he was one of the authors of Federalist Papers. He ended up only writing 3 of them. He was also the first Supreme Court Chief Justice, but this was before the Supreme Court really had any actual power. He found that position quite meaningless, and so he resigned shortly after. But what had happened during this time um, is that Britain was beginning to seize ships, right? Britain was trying to cut off any kind of trade from France, and you had the United States, right, which was a neutral nation during this time, trying to trade with both Britain and France. And Britain was actually seizing American ships, right? They were seizing these ships even though America was a neutral nation. And so in 1793, the British seized 250 American ships. And not only were they seizing the goods on them, they were claiming that there were runaway sailors, right? Sailors who had uh, sailors who had run away from duty, right? They were on the run, they were AWOL, and so they were seeking to return them back to service in the British Navy. However, more often than not, this wasn't true, right? What happened is that they were impressing American sailors and American merchantmen sailing on these ships into the British Navy because the British Navy was going to war with France. They needed as many men as possible. And so they used this as an excuse to Shanghai and impress as many Americans as they could into their Navy. So Washington dispatches John Jay for a diplomatic solution. Now, unfortunately, Jay really doesn't have a lot of political leverage, right? Britain is still the most powerful nation on earth. And there's still a lot of resentment between these two nations because of the revolution. And so Dick Jay still, even without this political leverage, he negotiates the treaty the best he can. And so what it does is Britain allows the U.S. they can submit claims for illegal seizures. And the British also say, okay, we'll withdraw our Indian agents into Northwest Territory, right? Keep in mind, this is many years after the Revolution, and there are still British agents and British troops on U.S. soil in the Northwest Territories at this time, right? But in return, the United States promises to pay British merchants pre-revolution debt and accept Britain's right to stop neutral ships. So basically what happens here is the British are saying, okay, fine, we'll withdraw our Indian agents and you guys can submit claims, but we're not going to honor those claims. You can submit claims for illegal seizures, but you have to accept the right that we have the right to stop neutral ships, right? To take as any ships that we want to. And also you have to pay British merchants pre-Revolutionary War debt, right? So this is a terrible treaty for the United States. When John Jay comes back, he notes that when he was riding from Philadelphia to New York, he said he could ride at night because his effigy was burning all along the way, right? He could see his effigy and burning. Basically, people were making effigies or figures that look like John Jay and light them on fire because it was such a hated treaty, right? He could ride at night on his horse because there were so many people lighting fires of his effigy. Um, and so it does pass, unfortunately, right? The Federalists who were favorable towards Britain, who wanted to avoid war with Britain, they passed the treaty, but many people claim it is way too conciliatory toward Britain. Now, as I said before, you do have the rise of political parties at this time, right? So what's the difference between the Federalists and the Republicans? Basically this, right? The Federalists, you have John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, right? Those are the kind of two major leaders of this party. They favor a strong national government, right? They support Hamilton's financial program, and they feared liberty denigrating toward anarchy, right? They kind of wanted a little bit more order, right? A little less democracy, if you will, right? A little too much democracy led to anarchy. Whereas the Republicans, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were the primary leaders of this party. They had what's faith in what's called democratic self-government, right? That politics should be done at the local level and the state level, right? The federal government should have very, very little power and as little power as possible. They favor broad democratic participation, right? Allowing as many people as possible to participate in the democratic process. They were very critical of social and economic equality, and they had this belief in what's called the agrarian dream, right? They were very critical of urbanization and industrialization, right? They believed that the virtue of the nation was in its farmers, and the people who were independent farmers, especially, right? That's where the nation's future was in, right? That's what would make the United States a virtuous and powerful nation. Was by supporting westward expansion, supporting broad democratic participation, and having most people be able to own land and be able to live off that land and self-govern them and be able to self-govern. So, Washington's farewell address. So Washington, no, just keep in mind, um, many people think that it was already in the Constitution by this time that the president could only serve 2 terms. That's actually not the case. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he served 4 terms as president. I should say he was elected to 4 terms. He died shortly after the beginning of his 4th term, right? About a month into it. Harry Truman fulfilled his 4th term, and then Harry Truman was elected to 1 term of his own, and then he no longer ran for president. Now, the 22nd Amendment, which established in law in the Constitution that a president shall only serve 2 terms, that was passed in 1947 and then ratified in 1951. But Washington set the precedent that a president should only serve for 2 terms, right? That was again, Washington was the man to set precedent for future presidents. Many people wanted him to continue to be president. He didn't want to. So by 1796, he decides he's going to resign. He's not going to seek re-election. And he's going to give a farewell address, right? So he decides against running for a 3rd term. And this is a precedent that would continue until 1940. Now, it was not a spoken address, right? But it was published in several newspapers in September of 1796. And this is Washington's last attempt at a national policy, right? He despised the fact that there were political parties beginning to form, and he wanted the nation to resist factions and also avoid long-term alliances with foreign nations, right? Another thing he wanted the nation to avoid as well was debt, right? Large amounts of it. And we have failed at every single one of these. We have very contentious factions that exist today, right? Political parties. We are $35 trillion in debt and counting. And long-term alliances with foreign nations, again, it's a complicated world, yet here we are. We're in many different alliances with many different nations. Now, the election of 1800, okay? Before I talk about that, with 1796, so John Adams, right? He's Washington's vice president. He is he's the first and only Federalist president that we ever have. So Adams wins election. It's a very close election. Jefferson comes in 2nd place. He's his vice president. And again, as I said before, this is a big problem because Jefferson is part of a different party, right? And Jefferson is opposed to Adams in every single way possible. He's not going to support any of his policies. He's not going to support um, any of his policies or political opinions or his appointments to positions of power, like his cabinet officials or people he appoints as judges. Um, in any way, right? So Jefferson just has basically at this point, like he doesn't really do anything during his vice presidency. He just goes back to Virginia, goes back to Monticello, and just bides his time and waits till till 1800 when he can run for president again. But it's a very close election, 1796. Adams defeats Jefferson 71 to 68, right in the electoral vote. Um, now, um, there's one thing that happens during Adams' presidency that we really should note. Now, during this time, as we said before, there was conflict between Britain and France that was already coming out in the open, right? They were very much at war with one another. Uh, and the British had already begun to seize American ships, right? Jay's Treaty was supposed to kind of put an end to that, but it didn't really. And now the French were starting to get in on the action too. Now many people say that this is kind of a quasi war, right? There was never an actual declaration of war given, right? The United States never officially went to war with France, but there were instances where American ships did do combat with French ships during this time. Again, for the purpose of protecting merchant shipping and to protect them from being impressed and seized by French ships. Now, many people wanted Adams to declare war against France. He refused to do so. But Congress, which was controlled by the Federalists, and they were incredibly suspicious of the French. Part of the reason why is because by this time there were about 250,000 French immigrants that were living in the United States. Right, many of them were refugees from the Revolution, but there was a lot of consternation and suspicion about these French citizens, right? These French immigrants who'd come in, many people question their loyalties, question, are they going to be loyal to the United States? Now there were two acts that were passed that became incredibly unpopular, and it really, really put a blemish on Adams' presidency, right? So the first one was the Alien Act. So basically what this did is it authorized the deportation of foreigners, without any kind of due process whatsoever. So there was a separate act called the Alien Enemies Act. So this was the deportation of aliens from countries at war with the U.S., right? With the expectation was that the U.S., once they passed this act, the U.S. would go to war with France, and then therefore they could just deport any person who was a French citizen from the United States just like that, no problem whatsoever. You also had the Alien Friends Act that was passed as well. So the Alien Friends Act, this was the deportation of aliens suspected of being involved in subversive activities, right? So even if we weren't at war with a certain nation, if there were any immigrants or aliens who were from another nation that perhaps even we were friendly with, if they were accused or if there was suspicion of them being involved in subversive activities, they could be deported. Another thing you have as well is a Naturalization Act. So what this did is it actually lengthened residency requirements for American citizenship from 5 to 14 years. So before, you only had to live in the United States for 5 years to become a naturalized citizen. Because of this act, it went from 5 to 14. Now, the Sedition Act, what did this do? So the Sedition Act, it prohibited the publication of, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious materials about the government, particularly the president or members of Congress, right? Now, what happened here is that judges who were appointed by the Federalists, who were appointed by a Federalist president or and by a Federalist Congress, judges showed partisanship in enforcement of this act, right? So anyone who was even slightly negative, or posted any or published anything that was critical of the Adams administration or the Federalists, right? They could be brought to trial and convicted under federal law according to this act, right? It's a terrible, terrible violation of the First Amendment, right? These laws became incredibly unpopular. And during this time, you have Jefferson and Madison write what's called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. Hold on. So you have Madison and Jefferson who write the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions during this time. And basically what these resolutions say is that states should have a right to nullify federal law, right? They're saying that these laws are unconstitutional. Now, there was no one who really took these resolutions too seriously, but these resolutions would kind of be the seed, kind of be the embryo of this idea of nullification, right? This idea that states could, if they wanted to, so I believe I was talking about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So as I said before, right, the Jefferson and Madison are the ones who are kind of behind these resolutions. They were penned. They were penned with the intent to have them passed by the Virginia and Kentucky legislatures. They never actually were passed. But again, it provides kind of the beginning of this idea of state nullification, right? Later on in the 19th century, you'd have states like South Carolina that would put forth this argument that they had a right to nullify federal law, right? The states were sovereign, right? That was kind of which, from the Articles of Confederation, that was true. But the Constitution was meant to give supremacy of federal law over state law, right? States could still have passed their own laws, but federal law, was, if there was state law that contradicted federal law, then that federal law would override that state law, right? There's nothing in the Constitution that says the states can nullify federal law. But yet there were some people who claimed that because these laws were so unconstitutional that they had a right to do so, right? There still wasn't quite yet a consensus on how exactly did the nation decide what was constitutional and what was not constitutional. Now, let me show you guys a quick video kind of about the election of 1800 that helps explain it a little bit better. Here we go.
Presidential elections can be unpredictable and get downright nasty. During one such election, close allies betrayed each other for political gain, leaders issued threats in Congress, and candidates leveraged personal attacks in the media. Ring any bells? That's right, the election of 1800. At the time, political parties were something of a novelty. President John Adams was running for re-election as a member of the Federalist Party. His opponent, Thomas Jefferson, who had thrown his hat into the ring as a Democratic Republican. Although Adams and Jefferson had once been close friends, particularly while working together on the Declaration of Independence, they had become bitter rivals. Back then, and like now, the nation was embroiled in a hotly contested debate about how much the government should be involved in daily life. Jefferson argued that Adams and the Federalists were sympathetic to the British monarchy and threatened the spirit of 1776. He even called the party a reign of witches. In contrast, the Federalists contended that Jefferson had become radicalized while working as a diplomat in France, labeling him a howling atheist. Alexander Hamilton, a proud Federalist, similarly hated Jefferson and his politics. But he also despised Adams, his own party's candidate. In a blistering pamphlet meant to be seen just by other Federalists, Hamilton condemned the president's disgusting egotism and distempered jealousy. But it was leaked to the press and published in the newspapers. And what happened next? The election resulted in a tie. At the time, members of the Electoral College voted for their top two choices for president, with the first place candidate becoming the commander-in-chief and the second place candidate becoming vice president. Unexpectedly, Jefferson and his vice presidential running mate Aaron Burr both received 73 votes. In a major upset, President Adams and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney receded into third and fourth place. The House of Representatives had to break the stalemate, leading to a heated battle in Congress. The governor of Pennsylvania, and a staunch Jefferson supporter, threatened to send a militia of 20,000 men to Washington. The governor of Virginia issued similar warnings. Adams himself worried that a civil war was expected. In the end, the House voted 36 times before finally electing a victor: Thomas Jefferson. Aaron Burr would be vice president, and as many of us know, killed Hamilton in a duel a few years later. Despite the rancor of the election, the peaceful passage of power from one party to another was a revolutionary idea in and of itself. As for Adams and Jefferson, they actually reconciled years later and kept in touch, sending each other more than 150 letters. The two presidents died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence was signed. In the world of politics,
All right. So yeah, I mean, when it comes to presidential elections, right, contentious elections in American history are nothing new, right? The election of 1800 is often considered up there with one of the worst, and definitely one of the most contentious in our nation's history. Now, it should be noted that part of the reason why Jefferson won was because Hamilton actually threw his support behind Jefferson, right? Um, Hamilton didn't like Jefferson, right? They were bitter rivals, but he hated Burr more. He called Aaron Burr, he called him an embryo Caesar, right? Someone who would become a dictator. And he called him the most unfit man in the United States for the office of president, according to it's what Hamilton said. Um, but it resulted in a peaceful transfer of power, right? And again, some people may say, well, duh, of course, that's what's supposed to always happen. But again, this was unprecedented because this is the first time in American history that power has passed from one political party to another, right? We've seen in history, even in modern history, when a rival opposing opposing party wins power, it can lead to fighting, it can lead to violence, it can lead to civil war, right? That is not what happened here, right? So it's often called the Revolution of 1800, but it is a momentous, very momentous and very important moment in our nation's history. Okay. So, as I said before, the Revolution of 1800, it was a revolution because in the sense Jefferson was seeking to kind of roll back many of the Federalist intrusions, right? At least what he perceived to be intrusions of the federal government. So he repealed the Alien Sedition Acts, right? They were incredibly unpopular. He wanted to give more power back to the states and the people. He wanted a more strict interpretation of the Constitution instead of a more flexible view of the Constitution, kind of using the necessary and proper clause to pass whatever legislation they wanted. And he wanted to curtail the power of the executive. His support was more for independent yeoman farmers, right? This idea of this agrarian vision, that the nation's virtue lay in the soil, in the land, in independent farmers. He wanted to move away from industrialization, from urbanization, away from a place, because at this time, many Democratic Republicans viewed cities as these seedbeds of vice and malice and envy and all things sinful and evil, right? And that industrialization would destroy the fabric of community and society, which in some ways it did. Right. But he also wanted to avoid foreign entanglements as well. But unfortunately, this was a little bit difficult, right? You still had the British who were still at war with France, and the British were still impressing American sailors into their navy, right? And they still were stopping and seizing American merchant ships at this time. So, now, from 1800 to 1825, we have what's called the Republican dynasty, right? Every president who serves at this time is a member of the Democratic Republican Party. By John Adams, as I said before, he is the first and the last Federalist president, right? There was never another. That he was the only Federalist president, and there will never be another Federalist president again. The party dies out. Uh, really by 1820, the party is just is dead, right? There are still some Federalists who exist, but especially after the War of 1812, the Federalists die as a party, and they become subsumed into the Democratic Republican Party. So you have Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, who are all from Virginia, right? You have the three Virginia Republican presidents. Now, I'm going to go over a couple of key highlights from this. So first, Marbury versus Madison. Many people consider this one of the most important Supreme Court cases in American history. And I'm going to show you guys a video that kind of explains in a little bit more detail why that is. So let me show you. Here we go.
have called it the most important case in the history of the Supreme Court. What started out as a minor matter about federal jobs turned into a legal decision that resonates to this day. You want legal drama? You got it. This is the story of Marbury versus Madison. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson defeated John Adams in the presidential election. Just before he left office, Adams appointed a bunch of judges from his Federalist Party to the District of Columbia courts. These appointments were approved by the Senate and signed by the president. Great, but there was a holdup. The last step before these judges could take office was a commission, a formal piece of paper that said essentially, this is their job and these guys are good to go. These commissions hadn't been delivered yet, which meant the judges couldn't start their jobs yet. And when President Jefferson took office in March of 1801, he said, not so fast on those commissions. He had his Secretary of State, James Madison, keep them from being delivered. One of those prospective judges was named William Marbury, a Federalist Party member from Maryland. Marbury said, no fair, I want my judge job, and he brought the case to the Supreme Court. Marbury wanted the court to issue a writ of mandamus. That's legalese for a court order. Marbury wanted the court to order Madison to show why he couldn't get his commission. In 1803, Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall himself, a Federalist appointed by John Adams, ruled on the case of Marbury versus Madison. He saw this as an opportunity to establish some important legal precedents, decisions that extended way beyond whether or not Marbury got his job. First, Marshall ruled that Marbury had the right to receive his commission. So that means I get my judge job, right? Relax, Marbury. Marshall also ruled that Marbury had a right to remedy, to have his wrong righted. Okay, so I get my job. Yeah, not so, relax, Marbury, chill out, buddy. There was a third part to Marshall's decision, and this is what made Marbury versus Madison so important. Marshall ruled that the Supreme Court didn't have the power to make Madison hand over Marbury's commission. So wait, what? In making his ruling, Justice Marshall had the court rule on itself. Marshall brought up the Judiciary Act of 1789. This was a law that gave the Supreme Court the power to rule in cases just like this. But Marshall ruled that Section 13 of this law violated the Constitution because it gave the court powers the Constitution said it shouldn't have. Long story short, it wasn't the Supreme Court's place to rule in a decision like this. In striking down the Judiciary Act of 1789, Marshall also struck a blow against the authority of Congress. The Constitution, as Marshall put it, was the supreme law of the land. Whenever Congress and the Constitution were in conflict, the Supreme Court would turn to the Constitution. This is called judicial review, and it's been an important function of the Supreme Court ever since. In relinquishing the power it was granted in 1789, the Supreme Court defined its emerging role for the young nation. The court staked out its claim as a branch of government equal to and independent of Congress and the executive branch. All that from a case about someone's paperwork not getting delivered.
So, right, it's a little bit of a confusing case in some ways, right? But what's important about it and what's significant about it is that, again, so you have Marbury, he's appointed at the last moment to a judgeship by John Adams, right? They're called the Midnight Judges. So Madison, he's the Secretary of State, he refuses to issue the commission. So John Marshall voids the law, the Judiciary Act of 1789, that allowed him to do that, claiming Marbury had a right to serve. But he couldn't because, the Supreme Court could not force Madison to issue that commission, right? Creating establishing the precedent, the Supreme Court was independent, did have a check and a power check on Congress, and also on the president as well, right? They could say that certain presidential actions or congressional acts were unconstitutional and overthrow them. Good example is that the Supreme Court could even check itself, right? We saw that happen recently with the overturning of Roe versus Wade. Dobbs v. Jackson in 2022 overruled the 1973 ruling and said the Supreme Court went too far in that ruling and basically overturned itself, right? So again, we see that precedent established in 1803 with Marbury versus Madison. Okay. Another thing that we see happening as well during this time is a war in American history that's often forgotten, right? During this time, many people say, oh, if there's a war, right, we're talking about the War of 1812. But there's actually another war If you're familiar with the Marine hymn, right, it talks about from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Those shores of Tripoli actually have to do with a war called the Barbary Wars. Again, this wasn't necessarily an official war that was declared, but it was Jefferson exercising, again, for someone who wanted to curtail executive authority. He would often use justifications to expand executive authority, including his war-making powers, right? So, during this time, you had the Barbary pirates, the Barbary states, who in the Mediterranean, they would often stop shipping. They would stop ships and they demanded tribute in order to avoid, they demand tributes from nations in order to avoid them being raided. So the United States was now a part of, the family of nations, and they needed to pay tribute as well. So Jeff Lee initially refused, and he decided he was going to actually attack these nations. He was going to send Marines, he was going to send troops, he's going to send the Navy to fight against these Barbary pirates, against these Barbary states. Let's go ahead and see what happened when Jefferson decided to do this.
Immediately after the Revolutionary War, the U.S. lost the protection of the naval forces of Britain and France in the Mediterranean. And the Barbary pirates were the naval forces of the satellite states of the Ottoman Empire, who essentially demanded tribute or would seize commercial vessels and hold as prisoners and hostages their crews, and sometimes even put them into slavery. Jefferson heard about the seizures of American commerce, and he realized that something had to be done, but he was against paying tribute or ransom. So when the issue came up in Jefferson's time, Jefferson did explicitly authorize the naval forces that Congress had provided him to defend American commerce. And if they saw a Tripolitan Barbary pirate ship coming out to attack a U.S. commercial vessel, they were given instructions to go ahead and prevent that attack and to attack those vessels. He did not inform Congress of those specific instructions. It's important to emphasize that Jefferson did nothing wrong. When Congress provided him with these very impressive ships, their purpose was to defend American commerce in the Mediterranean. That's why they were built. That's why Congress paid for them. The notion that there had to be a declaration of war before any kind of military action went on between the United States and some other foreign country, that was not anything that occurred to any of the major framers of the Constitution at the time. They regarded the use of these vessels as purely defensive. They were going to be going out into the Mediterranean and protecting American commerce. And the Tripolitan or Tunisian or Algerian ships that would come out and attack our commerce had already proved to be aggressive and offensively attacking. The issue of a declaration of war never came up. No one suggested that these actions were illegal because of lack of declaration of war. The important precedent that an objective person would derive from these is that, first of all, that Congress can authorize the use of military force without a declaration of war, just by providing the president with frigates to defend American commerce. This is the way our Constitution works, with power over the same issue distributed to different branches. So it's very important that people realize that you can't simply resolve these kind of disputes in our constitutional system by saying, oh, the president has this power, commander-in-chief. the Congress has that power to declare war. That doesn't work. That's not what the framers intended. The framers intended to give powers to both branches, and indeed to the Supreme Court as well, to be able to affect the very same issues. So there would be conflict between the branches based on real power. So the Barbary Pirates then are a very important part of our constitutional history, and they show that Congress can give the president powers to use force, largely in that case in self-defense, in a continuing dispute with foreign powers.
Now, it should be noted, and what's interesting is, again, some people say that, this was America's first war on terrorism, right? These pirates who were, they were affiliated with the Ottoman Empire, right? They were a naval surrogate of the Ottomans, that they were using terror to extract tribute, right? To make sure that different Christian European nations and also the Americans were staying in line with what they wanted. Right. So again, we see the Americans going to war with these nations, right? That's where you get that's where you get the line in the Marine hymn, to the shores of Tripoli, right? Because of these events during the Barbary Wars. Okay, it's a couple things that happened as well during Jefferson's administration. You also have the Embargo Act of 1807, right? Again, this was in response to the continued seizure of American ships by the British, right? This was an ongoing problem, really for about 2 decades, right? It's the reason why it's one of the major reasons why we went to war with the British in 1812. Jefferson, in his second term in 1807, passes what's called the Embargo Act. It's an absolute disaster, right? The purpose was to hurt the British economy. He orders all ships to stop trading in Europe until France and Britain stop restricting trade, right? But this move hurts America more, right? Jefferson's hoping that Britain and France will stop seizing American ships and stop picking on the little guy, essentially. And so he orders all your American ships to stop trading with England, with France and Britain. But this is absolutely detrimental to the American economy, right? It kind of destroys the American economy in many ways. Jefferson's second term was a little bit of a disaster. Now, his first term was much better. Second term was a little bit of a disaster. Another thing that should be noted as well during this time, you also had the Louisiana Purchase happening as well in 1803. So this was the Jefferson purchased this area for, it was about 3 cents per acre, or about 50 cents per acre in today's value, right? Jefferson, the total amount that he purchased, Louisiana Purchase, right? It was, in today's money, it'd be about $500 million in today's currency. He purchased it for $15 million from Napoleon, right? Basically what happened with the Louisiana Purchase is that Napoleon had gained control of this land from Spain, right? It was from New Orleans. It's basically what today is a lot of the Midwest, everything west of the Mississippi River, right? You have what today is Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Arkansas, going up into the Dakotas, right? This is very, very fertile farmland. And Napoleon had this vision of creating this huge breadbasket, right? This new French Empire on the North American continent. But part of that was actually regaining control of Haiti. Now, in 1800, or sorry, I should say in the 1790s, beginning in 1791, in the colony of Saint-Domingue, which is now today is Haiti, we see a revolution beginning to happening, right? Haiti was, it was probably one of the wealthiest colonies, wealthiest colonies in the Americas. It was a huge cash cow for the French, right? They produced a lot of sugar there, but I mean, it was a place that was, absolutely run on slavery. So you have Toussaint Louverture. He was enslaved on a sugar plantation. He forged rebellious slaves into an army, and they began to fight back against the French. Right, Napoleon wants to reclaim this colony. Right, he understands its necessity in establishing a foothold in North America. He understands how important it is to the French economy, to building up France's wealth. Right, about two-thirds of France's overseas wealth from their colonies came from Saint-Domingue or from Haiti alone. So losing Haiti was a huge blow to the French. Now, unfortunately, well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, it is what it is. Maybe perhaps fortunately, when Napoleon's army arrived, they get sick, right? Many of them catch malaria. They and the Haitian troops are ready for them, right? The invasion of Haiti, retaking Haiti, um, it ends up being a complete disaster. So by 1804, you have Haiti become an independent nation. By that time, Napoleon, he's continued to fight his war against the British, against the European alliance that's formed against him. And he needs money to do this, right? So he realizes he's not going to be able to establish a foothold in the Americas, and so he contacts the Americans. He contacts Jefferson and says, "Would you like to buy all this land from me? Right? It's right next to you. It's adjacent to you. It's yours if you want it." And Jefferson, he negotiates a deal, buys it for $15 million or $500 million in today's money, 3 cents an acre or 50 cents an acre in today's money. And then this is where you get the Lewis and Clark expedition, right? They go west to explore this area and to begin to open it for settlement at this time. Okay. Another thing as well, the War of 1812. It's a very overlooked war in our nation's history. It's one that we don't often talk a lot about. Actually, before I talk about that, let me just show you something really quickly. So I went on these foreign entanglements, right? Domestic Western expansion, again, is continuing at this time. I'll talk about these market, transportation, communication revolutions. But the Louisiana Purchase, as I said before, so Napoleon, he's seizing to retake Haiti. Jefferson's really worried about the French taking control of New Orleans and the Mississippi River. And Napoleon feared an American invasion of Louisiana, right? So you have Robert Livingston, he's an American minister in Paris. He negotiates the sale of Louisiana for $15 million. And right, Jefferson actually wasn't wanting all of this land initially. He just wanted Louisiana. He just wanted New Orleans. and Napoleon just said, "Hey, why don't you just take all of it? Right? We don't need it. Just take the whole land." And so you see this ensures the expansion of American territory. It's also part of Jefferson's continuing agrarian vision, right? Opening more land for farmers to claim this land and to be able to move west, right? So all this happens in 1803 during Jefferson's first term. Now, if you look at this map here, right, you see the different tribes that live in this area, right? You have the Missouri, the Iowa, the Santee, the Sioux, the Cheyenne. If you look at this black line here, it shows the path that the Lewis and Clark expedition took from 1804 to 1806, right? They come up here through Missouri, up through the Missouri River, through the Dakotas into Montana, and whoops, I didn't mean to go ahead. And we come over here. They leave the Louisiana Purchase, come across what become known as Idaho, and then along the Columbia River. It's during this again. You know, if you want to read about Lewis and Clark, you can read in the textbook. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. But again, it kind of shows over here by 1803, kind of what the population density of the United States was. Right, especially in the kind of the Virginia, the Mid-Atlantic states, right? It's becoming increasingly more densely populated. Westward expansion was seen as a social safety valve. So having access to all of this land was seen as necessary for the American Republic to survive. Okay, so the War of 1812, right? Why does the War of 1812 happen? Okay, so some pre-war issues, right? So you have the British blockade of continental Europe during the Napoleonic Wars, right? You have British assistance of Indian tribes in the Ohio Valley, right? The British were supposed to leave the Northwest Territories in Ohio Valley after the Treaty of Paris in 1783. They had still not done so, right? The Americans didn't have the means to remove the British, to remove troops and British Indian agents. And also, there were some people who believed that Canada should have been the 14th colony, should have been the 14th state. There were some people who wanted the United States to invade Canada and to take Canada, right? It was seen as kind of a hostile neighbor to the north, right? It was a British possession, it was British territory. Now there were this war was incredibly divisive, right? It wasn't really a popular war. It was kind of it kind of depended on where you lived, right? A lot of Westerners and Southerners were very much in favor of this war because that's where a lot of the Democratic Republicans were from, who were very anti-British, and many Easterners, especially in the Northeast, people in New England who were a little bit more favorable to the British, were adamantly opposed to this war. And I mean, kind of think about geography as well. If you're going to go to war with the British, Canada is right there. So you're more people who live in New England, New York are more likely to be attacked by the British than, let's say, you live in Virginia or Kentucky and Tennessee, right? So there were many people who again, it was very divisive about whether or not they were going to go to war. It was a very, very close vote in Congress. Madison eventually decides to push forward with war. And the war itself was a bit of a toss-up, to put it mildly. And let me show you a little video, kind of explains it in a little bit better detail.
It's often been mislabeled as the Second War for American Independence. The War of 1812, which was fought between the years 1812 and 1815 between the belligerent countries of the United States of America and Great Britain, was a war that was controversial in its time and largely forgotten to this day. It began on two frontiers. The first frontier was the American frontier, west of the Appalachian Mountains. British outposts were allegedly supporting native tribes, giving them food, guns, ammunition to fight the American settlers who were moving westward. On the second frontier, the Atlantic Ocean, American shipping was at risk. The British government was forcing American merchantmen to sail into British ports to be taxed on all of their goods, even if they weren't doing trade with the British Empire. At this time, there was a war raging on the European continent. It was between a coalition of nations and Napoleon Bonaparte's France. Great Britain had been embroiled in this war since the 1790s, and it had been a long and costly affair for all nations involved. Across the Atlantic, it impacted the United States, as the great ally of the United States was France. If it were not for France, we would not be a free and independent nation from Great Britain. But with the beheading of Louis XVI and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, this great alliance was on shaky legs. Still, the Americans were trading with the French, and this did not sit well with the British. This was too much for some in the United States, mainly war hawks like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay. And in June of 1812, for the first time in its history, the United States will declare war on a foreign nation. The United States military forces, the Navy, the Army, they were ill prepared to go to war with the world's greatest empire. By late 1812, excursions into Canada, where Americans were trying to break Canada away from the tyranny, as they saw it, of Great Britain. Americans will push into Canada with mixed results. The war will expand out onto the oceans. Earning its nickname, Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution will score its first victory during the War of 1812. Other American frigates will also bring home prizes and victories, much needed to keep the war going at home. But back across the Atlantic, things are starting to change during the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon has come to grief in Russia. This will give a free hand to Great Britain to start paying attention to the pesky Americans back across the Atlantic. Thus, 30,000 British soldiers will be landed in Canada. Warships will end up off of American waters. The British will then, in 1814, land a force south of Washington, D.C., and capture and burn the United States Capitol. At the Battle of Baltimore, they will be turned back at Fort McHenry and will be given our Star-Spangled Banner by Francis Scott Key. The British will then turn to the Deep South, along the Gulf Coast, where they will fight at places like Pensacola, Mobile, and eventually at New Orleans, where an up-and-coming general named Andrew Jackson will bring home a victory in January of 1815. which 13 years later will propel him to the White House. Shortly after New Orleans, the Treaty of Ghent, which will end the War of 1812, is signed. Both sides will essentially go back to status quo antebellum. The British will hold on to Canada, the Americans will have their land holdings, and some improved fishing rights. Although much of the war was poorly prosecuted on the American side, there were enough victories to instill a sense of patriotism and pride. Perhaps the longest lasting legacy to come from the War of 1812 is our Star-Spangled Banner. While most Americans can't name a single battle from the War of 1812, they do know the words to our national anthem.
Right, and that probably is one of the most important contributions of the War of 1812 is the Star-Spangled Banner. Specifically came about after the British had captured Washington, D.C. In summer of 1814. Right, they burned down the White House. In fact, there's evidence today. You can actually there's people who've done excavations of the White House. You can actually see the scorch marks on the foundations of the White House. But the British burn it down. And shortly after, the British are seeking to attack Baltimore, right? They're besieging Fort Henry. There's bombardment of Fort Henry. Francis Scott Key, who was a lawyer, he had gone aboard the British ship to negotiate the release of a prisoner, of American prisoner there. The British keep him on board, and during the night, Francis Scott Key, he can see he can see the British rockets and cannon. Cannon fire, bashing Fort McHenry. Right, he's still looking for the American flag flying over the fort, and that's where you get the words like, "Oh, say does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave." Right, if you read the words of Star-Spangled Banner, it's a poem that Francis Scott Key wrote about this event. Right, looking for the Star-Spangled Banner, wondering if it was still waving in the breeze, wondering if this would still be a land of the free and the home of the brave. And it, many people don't realize it wouldn't be until the 1937 that it would actually become our national anthem. There were many songs that were often considered. Some people wanted it to be like America the Beautiful or My Country 'Tis of Thee, or Hail Columbia. But the Star-Spangled Banner became that became the idea, right? So again, if the very, very first verse, which is the most sung verse, it's actually interesting. If you read it, it's actually a question he's asking. Right? The whole verse is a question, right? It says, "Oh, say, can you see?" Right? He's asking, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous night fight, or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glares, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there." And then he asks a question, "Oh, say, does that Star-Spangled Banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?" Right? Probably, I think, was the most beautiful verse of that, verse 3. He says, "Oh, thus be it ever when free men shall stand between their loved homes and the war's desolation. Blessed with victory and peace, may the heaven rescued land praise the power that hath made and preserved us a nation. Then conquer we must when cause it is just, and this be our motto, and God is our trust. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph shall wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave." Right? And if you actually read it, it ends with an exclamation point, right? Really putting emphasis on it. Okay, we're almost done. So the war itself, again, the Battle of New Orleans, it's considered a decisive American victory. This is really where Andrew Jackson makes a name for himself. But it's interesting. By this point, a few weeks prior to this, the Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, had actually been finalized, right? But communication was still not great at this time, and so the British and the Americans were still going to war with one another. Thinking that, not knowing that their nations had come to terms by this point. Okay. Lastly, just two things really quickly. During the Republican dynasty from 1800 to 1825, there's a couple things happening. You have the what's called the market revolution or the industrial revolution, the transportation or communication revolution, right? This is the beginnings of the modern United States, right? It's an expansion of American capitalism, right? What you see happening here is better roads, better canals. All this allows for greater ease to move and communicate with the interior, right? As well as transport raw materials. This is what makes westward expansion, really rapid westward expansion, I should say, possible, right? For the nation to be, for a nation as large as the United States to be able to function properly, for its institutions to be able to withstand the test of time, and for this nation as large as it is to actually be governed. Without the technology and communications that we have, it wouldn't have been possible. And there's many technologies that are created at this time, right? You have the steam engine, you have mills, you have the cotton gin, telegraph, and all this leads to a rise in Western expansion as well as in urban industrial cities as well. So, neither Jefferson and Hamilton's vision fully came to fruition. I'd say that we're kind of still going back and forth between those two visions today, right? We do have industrialization and urbanization, but in some ways we still cling to the Jeffersonian ideal of, democratic self-government, right? That is the ideal that we strive for. And we still very much kind of value farmers in a way, kind of like we idealize like farmers as like the epitome of the American working class, or the or what it means to be American, right? Even though there's very few independent farmers today. But again, we kind of see these two visions playing out, and depending on what time in American history you live in, one of these founders is favored over the other, right? During the Civil War, Jefferson was actually very much looked down upon, right? He was seen as a Southerner, he was seen as a slaveholder, whereas Hamilton, who was in favor of states of stronger federal government, whereas Jefferson was in favor of states' rights, right? Hamilton was seen in a better light and than Jefferson was, and I think right now we live in a time where more people kind of favor Hamilton more than they do Jefferson. And again, it kind of just goes back and forth, depending on who the president is, depending on what is going on in the nation. Right, there's this constant back and forth, ebb and flow between whose vision of the nation is going to eventually win out. Is it going to be Hamilton or is it going to be Jefferson? And as you can see from this map here, right, again, this transportation revolution really does revolutionize the nation. It makes this nation becoming what it is, a very well interconnected nation, one that can function over large distances, actually possible, right? You have canals and roads. Now, notice that most of the canals and roads are actually being built in the north. It's really fascinating. During this time, many Southerners were against what they called internal improvements, right? They feared that capitalization, right, an increase in market capitalism would actually turn the tide against slavery. So you had many Southern slaveholders, many people of the Democratic Party who were quite opposed to any kind of internal improvements because it would compete with chattel slavery, with the plantation system of agriculture. Although they did favor some canals and some railroads, but again, only for the purpose of supporting slavery. So again, railroads, if you look, most railroads are built in the north, very few in the south. And all of this would later come to benefit the north by the time we get to the Civil War. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you guys so much for being here today. I will see you guys not next week on the 25th. But I will see you guys on October 2nd. You'll kind of get a similar recording similar to this. We'll talk about Antebellum America. Again, as a reminder, your reading assignment is chapters 10, 11, and 12 for the reading. Let me just double check that. Yeah, 10, 11, and 12. So just make sure you read that and just be prepared to go, and make sure you turn in your papers for next week. Analytical writing assignment 2, right? And I'll make sure to put that again in the video to remind you guys. Just please make sure you get that turned in. And then Kabor, you're in charge of getting those all turned in next week and getting them turned to Thomas so she can scan them and send them to me. Okay. Anyway, thank you guys so much, and I'll see you guys later. Take care.